Here with us in studio throughout this special broadcast, Mr. Dan Perry, international affairs analyst and former Europe editor for the Associated Press. Dan, you know, it is perhaps easier in hindsight, but is it really a surprise?
No, this seems to be a case of reaping what you sow. If Putin chose to deploy in Ukraine a force of tens of thousands of people run by a shadowy tycoon answerable to seemingly no one and mostly featuring ex-cons and use them for plausible deniability when it comes to war atrocities, then it can be no surprise when maniacs act like maniacs and they turn on their creator. So no, it cannot be a surprise. On the other hand, I would add one thing. Moscow is not just the state capital of Russia, it's the global capital of smoke and mirrors. So I wouldn't necessarily believe the apparent narrative, and I have to suspect there may be more going on than meets the eye.
And perhaps this is a good opportunity to remind us all that the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily always your friend.
Far from it.
Our senior producer is updating us now that the Belarusian president is just saying that the Wagner forces chief, Evgeny Prigozhin, has agreed to halt his forces' progress within Russian territory. So obviously a changing reality again by the second here. Maxim Pachenko, thank you very much for speaking to us this evening following every single development on the ground there in Kyiv. Back here in studio, Mr. Dan Perry, we're hearing Lukashenko saying what he's saying. Can we really take his word as a reliable one?
Lukashenko is not the world's most credible spokesperson, but he is maybe the world's closest leader to Putin. Generally, he's going to say what Putin wants him to say. Now, we spoke of smoke and mirrors not 2 minutes ago. Consider one thing. We have long been speculating that if Putin is replaced by an internal coup, it'll be by someone even worse. Prigozhin and his Wagner mercenaries are the epitome of that very thing.
Yeah.
So if Putin is trying to gain some support of the world, and I'm a very small conspiracy theorist, I'm really not, but this is so clear that right now, Putin has more sympathy from the West than he would have had since February 2022, because no one wants to see one of the world's biggest stockpiles of nuclear weapons, maybe the biggest, fall into the hands of Prigozhin and the Wagner military force. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of all this. None of us know why Putin was so tolerant of Prigozhin's provocative statements for the past many months.
Right.
We have suspected that it was that they were somehow in cahoots, and it was a means of releasing frustration.
Good cop, bad cop.
A little bit of that, and of course, Prigozhin always criticized the military and the defense minister. Never
not Putin. Yeah.
But today, today the Kremlin announced he's under investigation, and Prigozhin said it's not a coup, but didn't rule it out exactly. So. Again, it all looks, I think it would be foolish to claim that we understand what's really going on.
And also, if we're listening to the Russian president not naming Prigozhin, exactly. So both of them still keeping a certain distance from one another.
You asked before, could this mean the end of the war is near or less near? I know on your show 2 days ago, we began to hear a new line of Russian propaganda whereby the war has been a huge success and the Russians...
We can call it a day, essentially.
Russians sustained no losses, and even Kyiv they never meant to take, so everything is wonderful. That looked like the beginning of an effort to prepare public opinion for an end to the war. Does a mutiny punch a hole in that? Would it make it more difficult or less? If he pulls back today, as we're now hearing, I think it aids that narrative.
In either way, can Prigozhin already claim success, so to speak? Can the Putin regime regain its stability as it was short hours ago?
Well, again, it depends if they're in cahoots or not, and if this is a real mutiny. It's interesting to note that he stopped. And it's also interesting to note that even before he stopped, Putin was suggesting he would get amnesty if he stopped. So I think there is certainly dissatisfaction within Russia that we don't necessarily see in the polls or in anything said on TV, because it's not a free country, with the way the war has been going. And to a degree, Prigozhin has been speaking for people who are dissatisfied, including people in the regime. Now, the fact that he does not come from the liberal wing, but rather from the even more nationalist wing, is almost immaterial to a simple binary question of, are the people satisfied or dissatisfied with the war? And I have to think that despite a certain nationalist trend to want to continue fighting on, largely predicated on not really having the full information. There would be a sigh of relief stretching across Russia, Ukraine, the West, and the entire world if this were somehow to come to an end. So to the extent that Prigozhin is manifesting the frustration with the entire situation, he is weirdly aligned.
A potential ladder.
Yeah, exactly. He's a potential ladder, and he's weirdly aligned with global public opinion, bandit though he may be.
Yeah. Well, let's cross now to I24 News Senior International Affairs Correspondent Owen Alterman, who will be joining us in a second. But Mr. Perry, in terms of global stability, again, the full picture or the clear picture, still very, very vague. But could it be only further pushing Putin against the wall, as in forcing him, so to speak, to resort to extreme measures?
What could be more extreme?
The nuclear option, the nuclear gun that was put on the table.
That's the doomsday scenario, and you know, I mean, it seems foolish to rule it out, but neither do I think it's likely. You know, we don't have telepathic powers, and none of us really know what's in the head of Putin. It would appear that he miscalculated spectacularly.
Was it a miscalculation to use the Wagner group from the get-go?
Perhaps not. I mean, it's a question of balance.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't a good thing to do, but these are not good people. Wagner group did manage to take Bakhmut, which no one else did.
And
they were critical to the Zaporizhia success.
Right, and we are getting now reports that Prigozhin is saying his troops are turning back from advance to Moscow to, quote, avoid bloodshed. So your analysis from a few minutes ago is turning out.
What a humanitarian.
Yeah, right. So Owen Alterman is joining us now. Owen, again, a dramatic day with the situation on the ground, more perplexing by the second. Do we expect any statements or actions from Washington, from Jerusalem, or will Western leaders just let the situation be, so to speak, for this at this point in time?
Listen, at the end of the day, Ellie, I don't think Western leaders necessarily have a dog in this fight. As Dan Perry was explaining, this is a fight within the Russian elite. This is a fight within the Russian establishment. If anything, Prigozhin may even want to go harder at the Ukraine war, of a different strategy. Obviously, the United States is going to look for vulnerabilities, right, along with Ukrainians, as has been said throughout the day, in trying to find ways to exploit the situation. There's also been a lot of talk over the course of the day from Washington about that all-important issue of Russia's nuclear arsenal.
What are we hearing? What do we know?
Well, what we know is that the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, made a statement saying that he made a deal with Prigozhin to make him stop his movement toward Moscow. And then Prigozhin published his own statement saying that his troops will make a U-turn and go back to their camps. I mean, the situation has been very dynamic, and of course, nobody knew what to expect. But it just looks it's hard to understand what is real in this situation, and then his statements, and what is not real. Because it looked very dramatic and it looked very serious, and for him to to step back and make such a U-turn just a few hours after he said that he wants to depose the leadership of the Russian military, it looks really, mind-blowing, really.
Yeah, mind-blowing. That's perhaps an understatement, and we are seeing live images from Moscow as we speak. Dan, you're hearing what Mr. Nechepurenko is saying.
We're hearing everyone struggling to make sense of what is clearly nonsensical. I mean, Prigozhin is not a law-abiding citizen, but he's not a stupid man, and it is ridiculous to envision him declaring, apparently, initiating a putsch overnight and then changing his mind by evening because what? Because the Kremlin launched an investigation.
Thank you.
it's all rather absurd, and I think we have to take a step back and look at who really benefits from all this. Putin emerges from today, I think, weirdly not weakened but strengthened, because the world is now breathing a sigh of relief that he has not been overthrown by berserk mercenaries. And if he were, and I'm not predicting this, but it is a scenario, because the war has to end eventually. If he were to sue for peace and say, look, you see this insanity here?
I'm the responsible adult.
I'm going to stop where we are, and I have Eastern Ukraine, I have a land bridge to Crimea. Please recognize this, or at least don't get in my way. I declare victory and walk away. The West can offer Zelensky a European Union membership, and Biden is the one who saved the world from nuclear Armageddon.
Oh, right on time before the election.
Before the elections, and Europe has weaned itself off Russian natural gas, and everyone wins a little bit. And Prigozhin is paid off somewhere and goes to live in the Caribbean.
The rational thing to do would be to end this conflict, assuming that counteroffensive wasn't likely to make much progress. But there's so much irrationality surrounding this as well. Whether the fallout of this event changes that, right, and changes the psychology around this, or maybe changes the situation on the ground, at least it seems to me too early to say.
Well, it's always too early before something happens. I mean, after the fact, we'll be more knowledgeable, of course. We're just trying to find our way through the fog here and understand how these hitherto irrational players might proceed going from here. And I have to say, if Putin were to want to sue for peace, despite Owens being correct in saying that there is a humiliation factor to where they currently sit, luckily for Putin, he sits on a global historic best-in-class propaganda machine. And I'm pretty sure he would be able to sell to the dazed and confused Russian public a narrative of victory.
Owen?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's absolutely true. And maybe the bigger psychological obstacles wouldn't actually be on the Russian side, but on the Ukrainian side, right, where the Ukrainians would have to either formally or informally accept the current Russian positions and the current lines, which I think would be very, very hard for the Ukrainian public to do.
I have to say, we've been predicting this all along. The war in the end, it seems unlikely to end with total victory for one side or the other. So the question is, when have we reached an optimal point where everyone can get just enough to climb down? Now,
absolutely,
again,
you're right.
I realize
I think
that assumes rationality.
I think we're there. The question is, when will the publics and when will the leadership be there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was quite clear for some time now that the West will not be able to back Ukraine's declared end goals of Crimea, etc.
I've been saying for some time, the borders of Ukraine are based on the internal Soviet borders that were created by bad faith players precisely to cause mayhem in case of a secession. There is an argument where, to bring an Israeli analogy, for Ukraine to insist on holding on to these Russian-populated areas is a little like Israel insisting on holding on to Gaza or the West Bank. It may be in their interest to let them go, especially if they get all kinds of prizes in return. Maybe not immediately NATO,
EU.
The EU, and the world is now invested in making Ukraine a prosperous country.
If Zelensky is listening, Dan Perry, what would you advise?
They should not be celebrating, and we hear them very clearly saying we're not celebrating. They should be circumspect about predicting anything. And I'm not surprised that they continue to be maximalist in their stated positions.
Yes.
But they probably should be getting pretty close to understanding what will be their real position. Not their opening negotiating stance, but their real position when it comes to a grand deal that does leave some of its territory in the hands of Russia. And I think if they project a willingness to accept such a thing, they will be well rewarded. And if they don't, they'll face pressure, despite the current support.